The morning she arrived, I was already at the fence line by 5 o'clock, which was where I generally was, because the fence line does not require conversation, and the problems it presents are the kind that can be solved with wire and effort, and do not ask anything of you afterward. I heard the wagon before I saw it, the supply wagon from Abilene, 2 days late as usual, coming up the south road in the grey pre-dawn, with the particular rattle of a vehicle that is carrying more than it was meant to. I watched it come through the gate from a distance, 2 carpet bags in the back, a cast iron skillet tied to the outside of one bag with a length of leather cord, and a woman on the bench beside old Pete, who drove the supply run, sitting straight-backed in the early dark with the particular posture of someone who has decided exactly where they are going and is not interested in discussing it. I had sent to Abilene for a cook 6 weeks prior. My previous cook, a man named Garrett, who had been with me 8 years, had left in September to follow his son to California, and I had been eating my own cooking since, which was punishment enough for whatever I had done to deserve it. The agency in Abilene had sent a letter saying they had someone suitable. They had not mentioned that suitable was a 41-year-old woman with her own skillet, and an expression that suggested she had heard every objection anyone might raise and had prepared responses to all of them. She climbed down from the wagon before Pete had fully stopped it. She looked at the yard, the barn, the cookhouse, the bunkhouse beyond it, the main house on the rise. She looked at it the way you look at a place you are deciding whether to trust. Then she looked at me, across the yard, with warm brown eyes that were doing the same calculation. "Ada Greer," she said. "I cook, Caldwell," I said. "I own it." She nodded once, as if this were satisfactory, and picked up her carpet bags. "I'll start in the morning," she said. "Where's the cookhouse?" I pointed. She walked toward it without waiting to be shown. I stood in the yard and watched her go, and thought that the agency in Abilene and I were going to have words. The Caldwell Ranch ran 42 men in the fall of 1879. 42 is a number that sounds manageable until you are responsible for feeding it 3 times a day, 7 days a week, with a cookhouse that had not been properly restocked since Garrett left, and a wood supply that was 2 weeks behind where it should have been. I know this now. I did not know it when Ada arrived, because I had not been paying attention to the cookhouse in the way I paid attention to the fence line and the cattle count and the water rights situation along the South Creek. The cookhouse was the cookhouse. It produced food at the required times. That was the extent of my relationship with it. What I know is that Ada spent her first afternoon taking inventory, which I observed briefly from the yard and did not comment on. She moved through the cookhouse with the systematic attention of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what she's looking at. She made a list. She sent Pete back to town the next morning with the list and specific instructions, which Pete relayed to me with the expression of a man who has been given very clear directions and is not sure whose authority supersedes whose. "Get what she needs," I said. Pete went to town. The first morning, I was at the fence line again before light. I came in at 6:30 as I generally did, expecting coffee and whatever Garrett used to make, which was adequate and unmemorable. What I found was the cookhouse door open and light inside, and a smell coming out of it that stopped me at the threshold. She had been up since 4. There was bread, actual bread, not the flat sorry excuse Garrett had produced, but real bread still warm in 4 loaves on the long table. There was a pot of beans that had been going since the night before. There were eggs from somewhere. I would later learn she had found the 6 chickens that had been ranging loose behind the barn and that nobody had been collecting from, which told me something about the state of my operation that I did not particularly want to know. There was coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and there were 42 men in the cookhouse, which was not unusual. What was unusual was how they got there. She had gone to the bunkhouse at 5:30 and knocked. Not called through the door, knocked. Specifically, with the particular knock of someone who expects the door to be answered. She had told the men breakfast was at 6, and that she'd appreciate punctuality. She had then gone to the stable, where old Ruiz slept on a cot in the back room because the bunkhouse was too loud for his joints, and she had knocked on the stable door and told him the same thing. I know this because Ruiz told me later, with an expression I had not seen on the old man's face in years. "She knocked on the stable door," he said. "She said my name." He paused. "I have been here 19 years. Nobody knocks on that door." I stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched her work. She moved through the space with an economy of motion that was almost musical, the way some people do things when they have done them so long that the body knows the steps without being told. She did not perform efficiency, she simply was it, and when the men came in, all 42 of them at 6 o'clock, which had never happened before in the history of my ranch, she looked at each one of them when she set down their plate, not a general glance at the table. At each one, directly. I watched her set a plate in front of Ruiz and look at him the same way she looked at my foreman, Hayes, who made 4 times what Ruiz made and had a room to himself. The same way, I stood in the doorway for a long time. Then I sat down at the end of the table, and she put a plate in front of me and looked at me the same way she looked at everyone else and said, "The coffee's hot." I drank my coffee. I did not say anything, but I thought about it for the rest of the day. She had been on the ranch for 2 weeks when I first spoke to her about something other than logistics. It was an evening in October, the air finally cooling after the long Texas summer, and I was on the porch of the main house with a glass of whiskey I had not yet drunk when she came out of the cookhouse and stood in the yard looking at the sky. She did this sometimes in the evenings. I had noticed. Stood in the yard for 10 or 15 minutes, looking at whatever the sky was doing, with her apron off and her hair coming down from the knot and her hands loose at her sides. It was the particular stillness of someone letting something go. I watched her from the porch. Then I said, "The stars are better in November." She turned and looked at me. I gestured at the sky. "The dust settles," I said, "after the last of the drives come through. Less haze." She looked back up at the sky. Then she came to the porch steps and stopped. "May I?" she said. I gestured at the other chair. She sat. She looked at the sky. I looked at the sky. After a while she said, "How long have you been running this ranch?" 31 years. Since you were 26? 25, I said. "My father started it. I finished it." She was quiet for a moment. "It's a good operation," she said. She said it the way she said things, directly, without flattery. "As an observation, it keeps," I said. She looked at the yard. All 42 men were in the bunkhouse, the lights going out one by one. "Ruiz," she said. "How long has he been here?" 19 years, I said. She was quiet. "When did you last talk to him?" she said. "About something other than work." I looked at my glass. "It's a working ranch," I said. She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I looked at the bunkhouse, at the last light going out in the window at the far end, the one closest to the stable where Ruiz slept. "I hired him in 1861, I said. "He came up from Chihuahua with 3 other men. The others moved on. He stayed. Why?" she said. I thought about it honestly. "I don't know," I said. I never asked. Ada looked at the stable. "He lost those fingers on a roping accident," she said. "The left hand. He told me about it." "He told you about it," I said. She looked at me. "I asked him," she said simply. I turned my glass in my hands. The night was very quiet. "I have been running this ranch for 31 years, I said, "and I did not know that." She looked at the sky. "You knew," she said. "You just stopped looking." The porch was quiet. She stood up. "Thank you for the chair," she said. "Good night, Caldwell." She went inside. I sat on the porch for a long time after, with the whiskey I still had not drunk, looking at the stable. I went to find Ruiz the next morning. He was in the near pasture checking the water line, moving with the slow deliberateness of a man whose joints have opinions about cold mornings. He looked up when I came. His expression was the carefully neutral one that a man wears when someone with authority approaches and he has not yet determined the purpose. I said, "I never asked you why you stayed." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Because the work was honest and you paid what you said you'd pay." I said, "Is that all?" He looked at the pasture. After a while he said, "My wife is buried in the south corner, by the cottonwood." I looked at the south corner. "I didn't know that," I said. He looked at me steadily. "You knew," he said. "You gave me the ground." I had given him the ground. In 1868, when his wife died of fever, I had told him to use the south corner. I remembered signing the paper. I did not remember, or had stopped remembering, what the paper meant. I said, "I'm sorry about Maria." "It has been 17 years," he said, "but thank you." He went back to the water line. I stood in the pasture for a while. Then I went back to the fence line, which was where I generally went when I needed to think, without being required to speak. Ada had been on the ranch for 6 weeks when Hayes came to me with his hat in his hands, and a look that meant he was about to say something he'd rather not. "She's been offered a position," he said. "The Hargrove Ranch. They sent a man out yesterday." I looked at him. "Hargrove's in Waco," I said. "Yes, sir. What did she say?" "She said she'd think on it." Hayes left. I sat at my desk and looked at the wall and thought about 42 men eating breakfast, and about each one of them being looked at when their plate was set down, and about a woman who had knocked on the stable door and said Ruiz's name. I thought about the porch and the stars and the glass of whiskey. I had not drunk. I thought about 31 years of running a ranch well and what running something well actually required, and what I had been letting go slack while I focused on the parts that could be measured by wire and cattle, count and water rights. I was 57 years old. I was aware of what that meant and what it didn't. I put on my hat and went to the cookhouse. She was making bread. This seemed to be something she did when she was thinking, the particular physical work of it, the rhythm of it, her hands in the dough with the focused attention she brought to everything. She looked up when I came in. I said, "I heard about Hargrove." She kept working the dough. "He sent a man." She said, "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think on it." I stood in the cookhouse doorway. The smell of the bread and the warmth of the stove and the particular quality of the afternoon light through the single window made the room feel like something I didn't have a word for. "I'd like you to stay," I said. She kept working. "Because the cooking is good?" she said, not unkindly, just directly. "The cooking is excellent," I said. "That's not why." She looked up at me. "I have been running this ranch for 31 years," I said, "and I have been running it well by every measure I was using." I said it carefully. The way I said things I had thought through. "And in 6 weeks you have shown me that I was measuring the wrong things." She was quiet. "Ruiz told me last week about a horse he broke in 1873, I said. "A story he's apparently been telling for years to anyone who would listen. I was the last person on this property to hear it." She almost smiled. "It's a good story," she said. "I imagine it is." She looked at the bread. "Caldwell," she said, "why are you really asking me to stay?" I looked at my hat, which I was holding in both hands. "Because you knocked on a stable door," I said. "And you said his name. And I have been here 31 years, and I never thought to do that. And I would like—" He stopped. Started again. "I would like to be the kind of man who does that. And I think I'm more likely to get there if you're here." The cookhouse was quiet. Outside, the ranch went about its business. The sound of the horses, the distant voices of the hands, the ordinary afternoon of a working cattle operation. She looked at me for a long time with those warm brown eyes. Then she said, "I'll need a proper spice cabinet. What I've been working with is inadequate." I said, "I'll have Hayes build you one." She said, "I'll want Sundays to myself until noon." I said, "Done." She looked at the bread. Then she said, quietly, I had a husband. He died in '74. I've been cooking on other people's ranches since. I said, I know what it is to run something alone. She looked up at me. Yes, she said. I imagine you do. A pause. I'll stay, she said. She went back to the bread. But you're going to have to stop eating at the end of the table by yourself. It looks strange and it's bad for the men's morale. I looked at her. Where should I sit? She nodded at the chair across from where she generally sat when the cooking was done and the men had cleared out and the cookhouse was quiet. There, she said. I looked at the chair. All right, I said. I put my hat back on and went back to the fence line. But I was smiling, which was something Hayes noted and mentioned to no one, which was why I had kept Hayes for 15 years. She built the spice cabinet herself mostly, with Hayes helping on the joints, because she said her joinery was adequate, but not what she wanted. She organized it with the same systematic attention she gave everything. I passed the cookhouse one evening and saw her standing back looking at it, with her arms folded and an expression of quiet satisfaction that I found, without meaning to, entirely and disproportionately moving. I said nothing. I went back to the main house. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about satisfaction. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that comes from having done a thing exactly right and knowing it. I had felt it about fence lines, about water rights successfully negotiated, about a clean cattle count at the end of a long drive. I had not felt it in a long time about anything that happened inside a house. That winter was the best the Caldwell Ranch had run in years. Not because the cattle were better or the weather was kind. The weather was not kind. It was Texas in January, and it was exactly as unpleasant as Texas in January always was. But there was a quality in the operation that had not been there before. The men ate well and were seen when they ate, and there was something in the bunkhouse that Hayes described to me as simply better. Better, I said. Better, Hayes said. I don't know how else to put it. I knew how to put it. I just didn't say so. In February, she found me at the south corner, standing at the small marker by the cottonwood that said Maria Ruiz, 1838-1868, which I had read for the first time properly 3 months prior. She came and stood beside me. He comes here on Sundays, she said. After breakfast. I know, I said. I've seen him. We stood at the marker for a while. Then she said, Thomas. I looked at her. It was the first time she had used my name. She said it the way she said Ruiz's name at the stable door, specifically as if it belonged to someone and she was returning it. I looked at the marker. Nobody has called me that in 20 years, I said. I know, she said. Hayes told me. She paused. It's your name. I looked at the cottonwood, at the marker, at the particular quality of February light on the Texas grass. It is, I said. She said nothing else. She folded her hands and looked at the marker with the respectful quiet of someone who understands what ground means when it holds someone. After a while, she said, Would you like to have supper at the main house sometime, instead of the cookhouse? I looked at her. I'd like that, I said. She nodded once. Sunday then, she said. I'll bring something. She walked back toward the cookhouse. I stood at Maria Ruiz's marker for a while longer and thought about names, and about the things we put down without meaning to, and leave somewhere and forget we left them, and about the particular gift of someone picking them up and handing them back. We were married in the spring of 1881. 16 months after she arrived with her carpet bags and her cast iron skillet. The ceremony was in the Abilene church and was attended by everyone on the ranch, all 42 men, which had been her only specific request about the wedding. All of them, she said. Or it doesn't feel right. All 42 came. Ruiz sat in the front row. She had asked him to. He wore his good shirt, which turned out to be a white cotton shirt I had never seen before, and that was, Hayes told me afterward, pressed with actual care. He held his hat in his lap for the entire ceremony, and when the Reverend pronounced us married, he nodded once, with the expression of a man who has watched something take a long time to happen and is satisfied it finally has. Ada wore a dark green dress, the color of the Texas hill country in spring, and she walked to me with the straight-backed ease of a woman who has made a decision she is entirely at peace with and carries it. Accordingly, I stood at the altar and looked at her coming toward me and thought about a Tuesday morning in October and a woman climbing down from a wagon before it had stopped and looking at my ranch with the eyes of someone deciding whether to trust it. And I thought about 42 men eating breakfast, and about a knock on a stable door, and about a name I had left somewhere and hadn't known I'd lost until someone handed it back to me. Thomas, she had said, like it belonged to someone. It did. After the ceremony, walking back to the wagon, she took my arm with one hand, and with the other she carried the cast iron skillet, which she had brought to the church because she said she wasn't leaving it in the cookhouse unattended with 42 men about. I looked at the skillet. You brought it to our wedding, I said. It was my mother's, she said. It goes where I go. I looked at her. Then it goes where we go, I said. She looked at me with those warm brown eyes and the fine lines at the corners that came from years near heat and from years of looking directly at things and seeing them clearly. And she smiled, the real one, the unhurried one, the one that had nothing to perform and nowhere to hide. Some things arrive quietly, I thought. A woman with a skillet and a Tuesday morning and a knock on a stable door, and some things you only understand looking back, that the morning she fed every man on this ranch was the morning she fed me, too. I just hadn't known I was hungry.